Welcome, Judith, to Wesleyan. So good to have you back here on campus.
Thank you.
And here we are at the Center for Humanities, where you've been many times, I think, over the years.
Yep.
And I thought we'd start off in a mode of recollection, really. And I wanted to ask you how you first got hooked on philosophy. What really at first got you excited about philosophy?
Well, I think that I was introduced to philosophy in my synagogue. And I had a rabbi who was reading Spinoza and Martin Buber, who also had strong interests in literary criticism, and so one would find Erich Auerbach in the middle of his sermon.
Really?
So
what a rabbi!
Yeah, he was a stunning intellectual, and also a professor of religion. I guess there was one point where I became a disciplinary problem in the Hebrew school class,
Right.
and they sent me to the rabbi, and he said, well, we're not going to send you back to that class. Your punishment is that you're going to have to do a tutorial with me.
Yeah.
And I was very thrilled.
Yes.
And I bet it was about 14, and he asked me what I wanted to work on. And I said, well, I want to know whether there are seeds of fascism in the tradition of German idealism. I want to know why Spinoza was excommunicated from the synagogue. I was feeling some identification.
Yes.
And I wanted to know about existential theology. And I think he was a little taken aback, but we did end up meeting in a weekly way, and that introduced me to the idea of the tutorial.
Yes.
And I was able to read widely. I had already started in my parents' basement reading Kierkegaard and Spinoza because those books had been abandoned there. Apparently one of my parents read those texts in college and then abandoned their college textbooks to the basement. As an unhappy adolescent, I of course locked myself in the basement and found the books.
There they were. And when you got to college yourself, did you go to the philosophy department or the religion department right away, or was that?
Well, when I was in high school, I took 2 college courses in philosophy, both Intro to Philosophy and Introduction to Ethics, because I thought that I wanted to study philosophy.
And how did you get to French Hegelianism when you were a graduate student? What was your path to that area?
I received a Fulbright to study in Heidelberg. And I studied with Gadamer, and I took a series of courses on Hegel there. And the concept of desire was extremely important to me, the interplay between desire and recognition, which is so central to Hegel's phenomenology. It seemed to be a point of departure both for my philosophical interests and for my interest in feminism and gender.
Right.
And maybe that's all I really do, is think about desire and recognition, I think. Yes. Probably.
When I was thinking about your intellectual itinerary, I was considering this, what seemed like a jump from the French reception of Hegel to the work on performativity and sex and gender and identity and a constellation of concepts which you put under lots of critical pressure. But I guess desire, it's not so much of a jump, it's really the desire and recognition remain a focus for you, do they not?
Yeah. I think for me, gender trouble was, well, it emerged from my activism. Some people said, well, you're such a feminist, why don't you do feminist scholarship? I thought, oh no, I don't want to do feminist scholarship. I just want to read my continental philosophy over here and then have my feminist activism over there. But then I was invited to work on Beauvoir and Wittig, and that involved me in a kind of critique of dominant forms of feminism at the time that seemed to assume that women, that to be recognized as a woman, you had to be within a certain kind of heterosexual frame, or you had to have a particular relationship to the maternal. And I fought against that. Yep. And I wanted to open up the category, and I wanted to say that the category either misrecognizes certain people or fails to recognize them altogether. Right. So maybe opening up the terms of recognition was one aim of gender trouble. I no longer think that I am as compartmentalized as I perhaps was in those days. Yeah. And and I think there were strong connections between the work I was doing in gender and sexuality and some of the work that I was involved in lesbian and gay human rights. And even recently I wrote an amicus brief for a woman who had lost parental rights over her children because she was a lesbian, and when the state recognized that, and they found her unfit as a parent. This was a very important case in Chile that went to the Inter-American Court, and we won. We won, and we set a new precedent for actually every Latin American country, so that that particular disenfranchisement can't happen again. But you know, when I was asked to write the amicus brief, I got to go through their arguments, and I got to talk about gender, sexuality, kinship. I got to cite empirical studies, but I also got to make conceptual distinctions that I don't think I could have done without a certain kind of scholarly formation. So I see places where they do come together for me.
Well, it's interesting how the work, let's say, on misrecognition seems to have led you to a series of reflections on issues of vulnerability.
Yes.
And vulnerability became not just, it is a conceptual issue, clearly, and a really important issue in political philosophy and in ethics, but there the vulnerability was in front of you. I mean, it was not only conceptual, and it was, and so that I suppose an issue of conscience, or perhaps even an issue of recognition. And once you recognize the vulnerability of the disenfranchised lesbian mother, or the vulnerability of a group of people who are systematically oppressed, there is an issue of what one does with that recognition. That's both conceptual and embodied, I guess would be a word we could use.
Yes. I mean, there was a conceptual problem that had to be solved. I mean, just to stay at that level for a moment. I think that the theory of the performativity of gender was one in which, you know, we're all constantly constituting ourselves according to certain norms, or performing gender. And it really, it focused on agency and acts.
Yes.
And yet, at the same time, we're being formed through institutions. We're being called names. We're being we're having norms imposed on us. So who are we, such that we receive, or we're vulnerable to being called certain names, or we're vulnerable to certain kinds of social expectations or norms or whatever. So, you know, I felt like I actually needed to understand the domain of impressionability or receptivity to understand how it is we might be at once socially constructed but also self-constituting. So I had to link those two things, because there were some people who said, "Oh, Butler, it's all social construction," or "Oh, Butler, it's all voluntarism." And I thought, "Oh, I better put these things together." But you know, I think after 9/11, I was taken aback by this ideal of invincibility and invulnerability that was being touted by government officials. The U.S. should be invulnerable. The U.S. should be invincible. And I thought, well, why wouldn't this be a moment to recognize our international interdependency, or all of our dependency and all of our vulnerability, such that we would maybe think about new international norms or laws or institutions that would minimize vulnerability for everyone, not just for selected nations rather than others. So that became, you know, I had a very strong critical response to that particular idea of nationhood.
And do you see that development of a position as ethical, political, both? How have you come to conceptualize your relation to those terms?
Yes, I actually do think it's ethical, and I think it took me a while to acknowledge that I was working with an ethical philosophy. But I do think there are some general things to be said about what it means to be an embodied creature among embodied creatures,
Mhm.
and what our obligations to one another might be,
Yeah.
how we depend on each other, how that dependency and proximity is sometimes quite passionate and wonderful, and other times quite hostile and unmanageable.
Yes.
But I don't think we can eradicate the condition of interdependency, and I don't think we can eradicate the need uh, to live in a world with others we never chose, and upon whom we are
Yeah.
dependent.
Yes.
If not always in the most proximate ways, certainly in other ways.
Yeah.
So I think I'm kind of out about that now, and that I do think ethical philosophy in this sense can posit certain kinds of ideals or aspirations for political mobilization, and
Mhm.
and ideas of what a just political world might be.
Right.
And I guess I think that those kinds of ethical norms are implicit in public policy and even in state formations.
Right. It seems like recognition of loss is also an important feature of your thinking about performance, about politics,
Mhm.
about interdependency. That there is recognizing one's own losses and also the losses incurred or abided by other people
Yes.
seems very important for your own thinking.
Yes, I think it's true. When I was working on gender trouble, it was the early stages of the AIDS crisis.
Yes.
I mean, there were many terribly painful parts of that history. But one of them clearly was that one saw people who lost their lovers and who couldn't turn to their families or
Yeah.
turn to their employers and be able to state that loss. The loss was not acceptable because the love had not been acceptable, and they had to not only live with the loss but the denial of the love and the suffering. And it was really clear that part of the political mobilization at the time was to establish conditions of grievability
Yeah.
for those lives. You know, whether it was the Names Project or something else,
Mhm.
but to combat that, you know, kind of culturally enforced melancholia,
Yeah,
right?
right.
Where you're supposed to move through the world pretending that you have not just undergone the most catastrophic loss of your life,
Right, right.
and cover it over for social reasons or because of shame, or you don't
Mhm.
want to offend someone else with the mention of homosexuality or drugs or
Mhm.
sex work or whatever the issue is. So, you know, that I think did become an important part of
Mhm.
that book, even though I think people really focused on the agentic
Yeah.
part,
Yes.
maybe to the exclusion of some other dimensions.
Yes.
And I think I took that up again in Precarious Life and Frames of War,
Mhm.
as I was trying to understand why in the United States, both in public policy and in the media, the loss of certain lives were recognized as exceedingly grievable, whereas other kinds of lives were unmentionable or ungrievable.
Yes.
So that led me to think about how grievability is unequally distributed.
Yes.
You know, we can think about it as a cultural good that's
Yeah.
unevenly distributed.
Yeah.
And that has been important to my work. I think memorialization is extremely important, and I think there are certain kinds of activism that are bound up with combating the forces of oblivion or forgetfulness.
Let me end on a more traditional interviewer's question,
Yes,
I
please.
guess, which is I'm thinking about locking somebody in the basement with a library of books, an unhappy young person,
Yeah.
perhaps an undergraduate at Wesleyan or somewhere else, and say, so what books do you want to make sure are in that basement for young readers today, young people who are thinking about perhaps philosophy and politics and things that you're interested in?
I think, you know, if I had one book to recommend, it would be Plato's Dialogues. I mean, just get that down.
That sounds like very sage advice. Get down with Plato.
Just
and
get
everything.
that down, and then we can move from there.
Good. Well, thank you so much for talking with me today,
Okay.
and thanks for being at Wesleyan, and look forward to your lecture later.
Thank you.